Good morning and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I'm the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here. And I'm delighted to welcome to the Forum this morning Robert P. Jones, who is the founder and CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute. He's also the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, about which he'll be speaking this morning. Engaging him in conversation will be our very own Patrick Hornbeck, one of our parishioners, as well as the person who facilitated a class on Robbie's last book, The End of White Christian America. So we're very grateful to have both of them with us this morning. After Patrick engages Robbie in some conversation for 20 to 25 minutes, we'll be able to take your questions, and I encourage you to send in those questions using the comments function on Facebook, the live chat function on YouTube, or you can simply email me at pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. Patrick, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Peter. And good morning, Robbie. Good morning, everybody. Robbie, thank you so much for joining us for this forum.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here.
I know your book's only been out for about 2 or 3 weeks now, as Peter said, called White Too Long. So many of us here at St. Bart's and so many of my students at Fordham enjoyed and were really challenged by your previous book, The End of White Christian America. And I was struck reading this one that you include a lot more about your own personal experiences of race, racism, and Christianity. So let me start off with this. Why did you decide to take that approach with this book? And what was it like writing so much about yourself in addition to other folks?
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, it was something different for me. I mean, my day job, I'm the CEO at PRRI, and we do, we're a nonpartisan research organization that does public opinion research, demographic analysis. And so most of the time I'm used to having my social scientist hat on. But, when I wanted to, I started working on this book really spurred on by the events in Charlottesville, which we just passed the 3-year anniversary of that event this week. And that was really a precipitating event for me to, in earnest, start working on the book. And so wanting to work on a book on the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity, and having myself grown up in the Deep South as a Southern Baptist, in Mississippi, with a family history that goes back 6 generations into Middle Georgia, I really thought there was no way to honestly write the narrative really and to tell the story without kind of openly wrestling with my own family's legacy here. And because it was something I was going to be doing behind the scenes anyway as I wrote the book. I thought really the only way to honestly do that was to reflect on this more openly and kind of have it be part of the journey of writing the book and putting that actually in the text.
Well, thank you so much for taking that risk and being vulnerable. I want to acknowledge here we are, 3 white men having a conversation about the legacy of white supremacy in Christianity. And there is so much soul searching that needs to be done on the individual level, the congregational level, the denominational level. I want to come back to that, but I want to jump first of all to sort of the key finding, the major public research finding in your book. And I just want to quote one sentence that you wrote. You wrote, "If you want to predict whether an average person is likely to identify as a white Christian, and you could only know one attribute about that person, you'd be better off knowing how racist he or she is than how often he or she attends church." So can you unpack that? Can you explain for all of us how you arrived at that conclusion?
Yeah, that was a painful sentence to write. I have to say, as someone who, I still consider myself, Christian, grown up, identifying as white, and care deeply about the church and the work the churches are doing. Bless you. I love talking to another academic for going to the statistics first. That's often the thing that gets left out of the interview. So I'm happy to go there. But basically, one of the things there's a lot of history in the book. One way I describe the book is it's probably 50% history, really kind of grounding the narrative, maybe 20% memoir, and then another quarter or so statistical data. But really what I wanted to do was to look and one of the things that spurred me here was really seeing these very disturbing patterns in current public opinion data. And so whenever we would ask questions around, particularly questions around structural racism, we would get these disturbing patterns with white Christians of all kinds. And I think this is also the key inside of the book, is that we found this challenge of white Christians even being able to see structural racism. And it wasn't just among white evangelicals in the South, right? Sort of my people where I grew up. I mean, that would surprise no one. But we also found this very disturbing pattern, even among white mainline Protestants, right, for which the Episcopal Church is a part, and white Catholics as well, who have their own kind of more complicated history, here in the country. And so it was this pattern of seeing, just for example, on the question that's been, a lot of our minds since the killing of George Floyd by police. We had a question we've asked a number of years. Do you think that the killing of African Americans by police is part of a broader pattern of how police treat African Americans, or are these just isolated incidents? White Christians of all kinds, white evangelical, white mainline, white Catholic, are about twice as likely as whites who do not identify as Christian to say these are isolated incidents, right? They just can't connect the dots. They don't see the structural injustice connection behind them. Very similarly on Confederate monuments or flags, very similar. This may surprise, folks, but it's not just white Christians in the South. But there's a 30-point gap between all white Christians, including, again, mainline and Catholics, white Catholics, on the question of whether the Confederate flag is a symbol of Southern pride or whether it's a symbol of racism. White unaffiliated non-Christians much closer to the views of African Americans than white Christians. So that pattern exists over and over again. I am getting to your question, but what I ended up doing is very difficult in public opinion surveys to measure racism and to measure it well. Because if you ask people straight out, and this is one of the reasons why I think public opinion surveys haven't successfully done this very well. If you ask, for example, white Christians straight out, do you feel warmly toward African Americans, or do you feel coolly toward them? They'll universally say they feel warmly toward African Americans. But when you start asking these other questions that are more substantive about structural racism, you get very, very different answers. So I wanted to figure out whether these things were just kind of correlated, or whether they were independently connected between white Christian identity and racism. So I created this thing I ended up calling the racism index, which is 15 different questions. So I wasn't just measuring one thing or the other. And then I put it in a statistical model to figure out whether it was Christian identity itself that was doing this work, or other attributes. Like, for example, so maybe it's, excuse me, maybe it's just because white Christians are more likely to identify as Republican, or maybe it's because they're more likely to live in rural areas than urban areas, or maybe they're conservative, those kinds of things, are education levels. And even controlling for all those attributes, we found this really unsettling independent connection between holding racist attitudes and identifying as white Christian. And when I measured the relative power of these things, it turns out that that holding racist attitudes is one of the strongest predictors of white Christian identity. And again, not just among evangelicals, but among mainline Protestants and white Catholics. And then the last thing I'll say on this is it also turns out that church attendance is not a mitigating factor in holding racist attitudes among white Christians.
It seems like it's actually an aggravating factor, because the next sentence you wrote after that I just quoted is that if you're looking to recruit someone for a racist organization, you might try a church parking lot. So I have to say, I felt very convicted, to use maybe more evangelical language, by the how small the margins were in difference between white evangelicals, white mainline Protestants, and white Catholics. That the difference, or the trend line that you traced, was 18 points for one of those groups, 19 points for another one, 20 points for another one of those groups. And that they're all in strong contrast with non-religious folks. So I want to push you a little bit on that, because in so many church circles these days, people bemoan the so-called rise of the nuns. And you've done a lot of work on the increasing number of folks who've become disaffiliated. But it seems that being non-religious makes folks statistically less likely to hold racist views. So why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you, again, put all this in a model and you're even controlling for a whole range of factors, on average, whites who are religiously unaffiliated there is very little actually correlation between holding racist views and identifying as white and unaffiliated. I think, and again, this is also controlling for things like age, because the unaffiliated are younger. But even when you control for that, this still stands up. So what it tells me is that really white Christian identity is actually doing some work here. That is the thing. Even holding all these other things constant, the thing that really separates these groups is Christian identity. And I unpack that with the history. I unpack that with even in a theology chapter. And I think it is the history and the theology that we've inherited that I think has really not given white Christians the tools to have a better vision for social justice, and literally creates blind spots, I think, in ways that make it very difficult for white Christians to see it in the way that whites who haven't grown up with that sort of that lens have an easier time seeing it.
Well, as a theologian in my day job, I was really struck by some of the specific doctrinal points that you trace. And I think what I heard you saying in the book is that there are theological defense mechanisms, sort of plates of armor that white Christians often wear. And these are the things that convince us that when racism flows out of white Christianity, it's not because that there's a problem with white Christianity, it's because there's a problem with that particular person. And chillingly, you walk us through the journal that Dylan Roof, the murderer of Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, kept when he was in prison, and you say it's full of Christian iconography, Christian theology. There's this drawing that you reproduce in the book of a white Jesus. So what theological doctrines or ideas would you point to that most sort of immunize us white Christians against the racism that our tradition is carrying?
Yeah, well, the imagery you've used there is I think all kind of right. Theological defense mechanisms, armor, and maybe inoculate us against the kind of conviction that I think should be right in front of us. There is you're right about Dylan Roof. This didn't get a lot of play actually in the news, and so just as a tiny bit of background. So Dylan Roof was a member of the Lutheran Church, and he was a member in good standing when he committed, these atrocities. He grew up in the church. He was baptized. He was, a member in good standing of a local ELCA Lutheran church, which again is a mainline Protestant denomination, right? This is not a Southern, Christian tradition he was a part of, and he really integrated his white supremacist views with his Lutheran faith without really much tension there. And there is this one striking image where it takes up a whole page in his journal. There's something like 18 different crosses in this journal he had in prison. And one of them, the full page one, is an image of a white Jesus stepping out of the tomb, right? It's kind of copied from an iconography that you see. And even in he designed his own little personal logo to kind of express his identity. And in that, at the center of that logo is a cross, right? I mean, and then around the cross, and each of the quadrants created by the cross are white supremacist symbols that he stuck in these quadrants. So it was deeply, in him. And I think it is easy to dismiss, that as, okay, well, here's one deranged, person. But I think if you look at the history, you'll see, actually those threads are there for him to pick up very, very easily. A couple of things I talk about in the book are a kind of hyper individualism, I think, that comes from conceiving of kind of the beginning and the end of religion being about a personal relationship with Jesus, and that kind of screens out social justice questions, right? Because it's very interior, it's very individualized. And here, when I was thinking about this whole section, the indictment that Martin Luther King had in Letter from Birmingham Jail, I think was really, ringing in my ears, because in that letter, King wasn't railing against the cross-burning KKK, fringe folks. I mean, he was railing against the highly respectable mainstream, white Christians in Birmingham. And he has this line, I think we all ought to hang on to it, where he says, like, he's kind of bewildered, and he's like, where are these people? Why aren't they showing up, right? Why aren't they standing up? And he says, who are these people sitting safely behind the anesthetizing effect of their stained glass windows, right? Or they're sitting behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows. So another image, I think, is that it does have the effect of kind of calming and even lulling to sleep white Christian consciences, instead of raising them up and pricking them into action.
and King is such a great example of what we would think of as forms of liberation theology. I'm so struck, so maybe this is the theological geek in me, but you have this long section about post-millennialist and pre-millennialist Christianity. And I was really impressed by it. I'd never thought about things in this way before. So can you do 2 sentences on what these long, complicated terms are and why they matter for racism?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, without getting into all the premillennial dispensationalism, jargon. I mean, basically, there arose a kind of dominant view in the evangelical world that saw the end of times as only coming basically as human society degraded, right? And so the arc of history in that view is that human society gets worse and worse and worse, and only then will Jesus come and sort of set everything right. So now, if you sort of take that seriously, then things like social justice in the here and now, racial equality, climate change, like a whole bunch of other stuff ceases to matter. And in fact, if you work too much for the good of human society, you might be thwarting the second coming of Jesus, right? If you take it out to its extreme. And so that view became kind of dominant with the Scofield Reference Bible, which became one of the versions of the Bible that's been printed, millions and millions of times, and very, very popular to this day in evangelical circles. But it does kind of devalue the here and now, right? It's a kind of otherworldly thing, and it has this sense that things should be getting worse, and then Jesus will come and sort of set things right.
And that's a way of thinking in Christianity that goes all the way back to Augustine. I mean, Augustine all the Roman Empire in those terms. And so what white evangelicals have this long, long tradition to draw on. But I think it's part of this anesthetizing effect that Dr. King was talking about.
Yeah, and I can think the other thing to ask yourself, I mean, I think about, this is like the sociologist in me, is to always ask, like, when you see a theological development happening at a certain period of time, what's going on? Like, why is that attractive? Why is that worldview attractive? And in a post-Civil War era, when you've just experienced great defeat, a worldview like that it has 2 things. You've just experienced defeat, and yet you're still the dominant cultural power in your setting, right? So the world getting worse doesn't actually affect you that much if you're at the top of the social pyramid, right? So it can be something you can be a little bit complacent about, and in a way defends your position at the top of the pyramid, because you don't need to flip things around. The status quo is just fine.
Right, and accepting a certain form of social evil as the price to pay may also explain white evangelical support for the current administration, among other things. But let me switch the frame a bit to the Episcopal Church. And as an Episcopalian, I want to be the first to acknowledge that we often tell ourselves this narrative about all the wonderful ways in which we are progressive. So women's ordination, marriage equality, Michael Curry's sermon at the royal wedding. Mm-hmm. You remind us in the book that back in 1963, Martin Luther King's 6-year-old was turned away from an Episcopal school in Atlanta because he was Black. And you remind us that in 2017, it took up until 2017 for a church that bore the name Robert E. Lee Memorial Episcopal Church to decide to shed that name. And that wasn't even an easy decision for that congregation at the time. Yeah. So let me start this way. Like, what kinds of data about Episcopalians do your survey data reveal? And how would you diagnose the situation of racism in the Episcopal Church today?
Yeah, well, thanks for putting me on the hot seat for that one. But typically within the mainline, kind of largest 7 mainline Protestant denominations, the UCC, the United Church of Christ, and the Episcopal Church tend to be kind of on the more progressive end of the mainline world, with kind of the American Baptist and the United Methodist kind of more on the conservative end. Some of that is because they have the Methodists and the American Baptists have more of a Midwestern and Southern base, or some of it is cultural. But what's notable about the Episcopal Church, and I should say this as someone who grew up in the South, I always associated the Episcopal Church with the landowning planter class in the South, right? I mean, so I grew up Baptist. And so if you think about socioeconomics, the Episcopalians were up here and kind of plantation owners, and the Baptists were like down here. And what's remarkable about that, though, is that even sort of as a Baptist, and my family did sort of live kind of subsistence level farming, like 200-acre farm, and even there, I talk about in the book that my family had my sixth great uncle, which is like early 1800s. I found his will and estate. He had we had 5 slaves, even with a fairly modest income. But in the Episcopal Church, it's interesting because the places where stained glass windows, for example, have found where Confederate symbols, Confederate flags, Robert E. Lee, Andrew Jackson, and Jefferson Davis have found their way into stained glass windows has been mostly in Episcopalian churches. So you mentioned Robert E. Lee Memorial Church, but also in even outside the South, like in Ohio, for example, there was an Episcopal Church in Cincinnati, right? That Leonidas Polk, there's a plaque to him on the outside of that church. There were stained glass windows to Robert E. Lee on the inside of the church. Those have now been removed, I would say. So one thing that I would say is I do think the Episcopal Church has been, particularly since Dylan Roof and Charlottesville in particular, has been spurred to action. Oh, and the other more prominent one is the Washington National Cathedral. Mm-hmm. Right here in Washington D.C. That had the United Daughters of the Confederacy raised money to place symbols. There were Confederate flags and a huge window to Lee and Jackson, and they got placed in the Washington National Cathedral well into the 20th century, right? As kind of monuments to this kind of lost cause of the Confederacy. So I think like it has been both a place where maybe the highest church forms of symbols have made their way into those churches. But I would say also that that the Episcopal Church, I'm very grateful, has been also one of the more responsive places in the last few years. Setting up, for example, Virginia Theological Seminary, setting out a $1.7 million reparations fund. The New York Diocese itself setting up a $1.1 million reparations fund, and taking this question seriously, not just of, and I think this is very important, not just of apology and lament, but of repair, and taking that theological responsibility seriously. I think is something. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and particularly with when you take seriously the amount of wealth that's been amassed on the backs of slave labor, and even in a city like New York, right? That it's just massive amounts of money, and I'm sure and hopeful we're at the beginning of this conversation and not at the end.
Well, I was really moved. You talk as the book goes on about a number of places that have managed to have really, really difficult conversations about their racist past. If we had more time, I'd talk to you about the 2 First Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia. But you quote one of those pastors as saying that white Christians very quickly reach for the language of reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And that in many ways, whether consciously or subconsciously, the language of reconciliation can be not just unwelcome, but offensive in the context of decades and centuries of social injustice, economic injustice, physical abuse, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I'm really struck by, just as a white person myself reading your book, is that you continually come back to what James Baldwin famously called white problem. And you note early on that so much of the sickness that comes out of racism, so much of the wounding of souls happens to white souls, because we are twisted. My Fordham colleague Brian Massengill refers to it as the soul sickness that comes out of racism. And you have this image. So let me read you 2 more sentences that you wrote. You're talking about Baldwin's concept of the white problem. You're talking about the mark of Cain, and you say, we are Cain, meaning white Christians. It is white Christian souls that have been most disfigured by the myth of white supremacy. So what do you mean by that? Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought up Baldwin. So the title of the book actually comes from James Baldwin, the title "White Too Long," and I'm gonna read. I'm gonna take a little authorial prerogative here. I'm gonna read just a little bit more of that quote from Baldwin, because I think it's super helpful and gets to this question. So Baldwin, I think, was always hopeful that whites, and particularly white Christians, were going to step up like King. He really thought that white Christians would ultimately step up for civil rights. But after King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated, he was despairing, really, and he wrote this piece in the New York Times just a few months after King and Bobby Kennedy were killed, and he was kind of despairing about whites not stepping up, even in the face of that kind of violence. And this is what he said: "I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me, and has so impressed me for a very long time, as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They have been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. The effect on their personalities, their lives, their grasp of reality has been as devastating as the lava which so memorably immobilized the citizens of Pompeii. They are unable to conceive that their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history and a parody of theirs and an intolerable violation of myself." And I think it is the thing that I talk at the end of the book. I do say, look, there are deep and very, very troubling justice questions at play here with regard to our African American brothers and sisters. But that's not all that's at play, right? This is not only an altruistic move to fix something with someone else. But if we really take seriously, and I sometimes use the language of disfigurement, like how disfigured white Christianity has become, because it was built with this a priori presupposition, right? A commitment to the idea, really, that society should be organized to benefit white lives more than others, and was perfectly okay for most of its history in this country, hundreds of years, with that presupposition. Now, if we take that really seriously, it means that every doctrine we have, every liturgical practice we have, every prayer that has ever been prayed, in many ways, worked itself around that presupposition. And so I think there's a great reckoning, I think, that we really have to do with, and I even talk about it as kind of a genetic defect, right, that we have built into our theology and our identity over centuries. That's not something you undo with a quick apology, right? I mean, it really is going to take a deep, even like something like a bone marrow transplant, where the patient comes close to dying in order to reach health. I think we're in that kind of a situation to really recover. And I think about it this way too, is to kind of do what we can to fix that defect and to try to sit with it long enough to realize the ways in which it has disfigured our faith, so that we don't continue to pass it down, to the next generation.
Wow, that is so compelling. And I know we've got a ton of questions coming in from the audience, so let me just leave you with this last question. I know predictions are really difficult. Many of us, as we read your End of White Christian America, were struck by how natural your conclusion there seemed, that the power of white Christian America was coming to an end, and how disruptive the 2016 election was to that narrative and to that trend line. So as you've now finished this book and you look back on the events of the last 4 years in this country and you look forward to the next, let's say, 10 years, what do you think we're going to be seeing? And what are the things that we as members of congregations like St. Bart's need to do?
Yeah. Well, look, I do think part of the deal that we're continuing to fight over in this country, and that continue to demarcate our partisan polarizations, is really a question. We're very rarely fighting in the last 10 years about policy. It really is about identity. Mm-hmm. And I think the biggest divides between the two parties is a question of identity. It's a question of American identity. Who are we as a country? Who are we going to be? Who are we going to be okay with us being? And this long reach and this long shadow of identifying America with white Christianity, and particularly with white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christianity, is still very much with us. And I think some of the anger, some of the visceral nature of our politics, some of the willingness of white Christians to support President Trump at the levels that they do, I think really is because Trump has stood up and said, I'm going to turn back the clock. I'm going to literally hold back these changes in the country and preserve really a kind of vision of a kind of mythical vision of 1950s America. It has been, and that is, even as these numbers continue to slide. So when I wrote The End of White Christian America, I noted that we had moved from being a country that was 54% white and Christian to 47% white and Christian. That number today is 42 white and Christian. So we continue, right, to move into this new reality where white Christians are now one of many religious and racial groups at the table. And one of the ways I thought about this is we are still trying to hang on. White Christians, I think many white Christians are still trying to hang on to the ownership of that table. And I think the challenge is how do we let go of the ownership of that table and a dominant place at it, and how do we pull up a chair with everyone else, right, without trying to own the table. And I think that struggle, it's uncomfortable when you've been used to owning the table for all of American history. It's scary, it's worrisome, but I think the finally letting go of this marriage of America as a white Protestant country, I think, is really at the heart of what we're struggling with today. And so I think the work of white Christians is to kind of blow that myth up, right? It was never true. It was never Christian to think about a nation state that way, or our identity that way. So I think kind of recovering a more authentic understanding of what it means to live in a pluralistic democratic society, and our place as religious folk in that pluralistic democracy. I think recovering what that looks like, and being willing to kind of let go, I think, of kind of this, place that we artificially and violently defended, right? At our place at the top of the pyramid, and being willing to let go of that finally once and for all, I think, is the work to be done.
Robbie, this has been such a pleasure talking with you. I'm going to hand you back over to Peter for questions from our congregation.
Great.
Thanks so much, Patrick, and thanks, Robbie.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick,
for such a fascinating and important discussion so far. Our first question comes from someone who I think is trying to square the Catholic social justice movement, for which the questioner specifically was reared in and has a lot of affection for, with the kind of amount of racism you found among white Catholics.
Yeah.
How do you kind of make sense of that? How do you also make sense of differences in racial attitudes within these different religious groups?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, and here's the challenge. I mean, when you look at the history, you can point to, for example, statements by the Episcopal Church, things like Catholic social teaching. It comes out of the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference and from papal encyclicals that do chart a vision of social justice. But as Patrick pointed out, I mean, but we have these kind of contradictions, as the same time that Martin Luther King was on the editorial board, for example, of the Christian Century, which was the kind of most prominent progressive Protestant magazine. And at the same time, right, his child was being denied. He was being invited to speak by the National Council of Churches, right, to them. And at the same time, his child is being denied admission to a private school, an Episcopalian private school, on the basis of race, all at the same time. And I think the similar thing is true in the Catholic Church, is that despite all these great encyclicals that you can point to, economic justice for all from the Catholic bishops in the 80s, right? It was about economic justice. And here's the thing, I kind of chronicled this in the book, because it is, Catholics have a different history than white Protestants do, right? They have their own history of being discriminated against in the country quite vehemently. In fact, I mean, as late as 1960. Kennedy was getting beat up because, I mean, the most common thing he would hear even from white Protestants was, well, aren't you just going to get a hotline to the Pope every time we have a problem? And the Pope's really going to be running the country. There's a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. But the thing that I came across in the book is, and actually Brian Massengale was very helpful in his research here on this topic, that so there was a statement put out by the Catholic bishops on race and racial justice about every 10 years, starting in the 60s. Massengale, I kind of borrowed from him. He kind of points out that, so they put out the statement, 10 years later, they put out another statement. And the preamble to that statement says, 10 years ago, we put out the statement on racial justice, and yet things haven't really changed that much. And what Massengale found is that those statements at the top level, while they trickle down to some, folks like the person asking the question, they did not trickle down to the parish level, and that very few priests were preaching on them, and it just didn't get all the way down. And then I think the other thing, and this is kind of the, I think, insidious way that whiteness functions. Patrick mentioned the white problem, is that one of the things that happened, I think, in the later 20th century is that Catholics became white. And they were not considered to be, most Catholics were not considered to be white prior to the middle of the 20th century. Irish were not white. People who were Irish were not white. People who were Italian were not white. And this melding, I think, or this admission, really, of people who had been previously blocked from that category getting admitted also created a kind of perverse incentive among many white Catholics, because now they were in the club. They were admitted to this kind of powerful category of whiteness, right? And then there began to be self-interest, as there was with white Protestants, and perpetuating and protecting those boundaries.
One of our physician members of the congregation specifically liked your bone marrow transplant metaphor. And he points out that a marrow transplant replaces stem cells. And if that holds with your metaphor, what do you think the stem cells of racism in the church are?
Yeah, I'm way out of my scientific element here. Social scientist, not medical scientist. So look, I think as best I understand it, that works. I mean, there are these kind of seeds way back there, and I don't know if he or she can tell me whether this works or not. But one of the things that has stuck with me, particularly for churches who have been around, St. Bart's has, pre-Civil War, right? Is what did services look like in many of those settings? And today you can see it built into the architecture even of many churches, like slave galleries built as balconies, right? We see kids up there or whatever today, but many of those were built, to hold enslaved people, or in the two Baptist churches that Patrick mentioned, the predominantly white Baptist church down there, it was founded in 1825, and it had white members at the front. It didn't have a balcony, but white members were up front, and all the enslaved people that the white slave owners brought to church with them sat in the back. And even in New York, as late as the 1940s, for example, in the Catholic Church, to kind of bring this back around, parishes were where they would allow African Americans to attend, were required to sit in the back and to receive the Eucharist after whites had received the Eucharist. And so I think it's way back there, and in the American context, it's just in the seeds, really, of our faith. And again, if you kind of think about, in that setting with white slave owners sitting in the front and enslaved people sitting in the back, what could get preached, right, in that setting? What biblical passages could get read in that setting? And it's so distorting that it even shows up in a few artifacts. One quick one I'll reference is in the collections of Fisk University is a so-called slave Bible. And that Bible was printed to be used with white missionaries and enslaved people. And it basically excises any problematic parts of the text. So it has the book of Exodus, for example, but it has the story of the Israelites being enslaved, but not their liberation. That part literally got cut out of the Bible. And so I do think it's, I'm not sure I'm going to fully pull off the metaphor, but most of what I was meaning, it just goes all the way down and all the way back. And so I do think, if we don't kill it all the way down, I guess maybe there's one way to get close there, it will replicate itself again, right? And so I think killing it all the way out and not leaving any corner, untouched, I think is vitally important. I mean, this is not a surgical, kind of surgical, cut. I mean, this is something sort of that goes all the way down.
We have a question about the role of the intellect in combating white supremacy. Churches are institutions of kind of moral persuasion, but they're also educational institutions. To what extent do churches, religious organizations, have an educational kind of mandate in this area?
Yeah, well, this is huge. I mean, I think I told actually Peter and Patrick before we got on here that I do think conversation at the congregational level is really where this change will happen. It's not going to be, I mean, clearly the history shows that another statement by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church or another statement by the National Council of Churches is really going to, or the National Association of Evangelicals isn't going to get us there. I mean, it really is going to be conversations on the ground, and it's going to, because it takes time to sit with it. I mean, I can say this from my own experience. it's really uncomfortable. And I think the early cognitive dissonance that happens, when you become more aware of these things is unsettling. And so I think having a community that can be uncomfortable together is actually pretty important, and that can kind of help hold each other in that space long enough for the work to get done, because a lot of dismantling has to happen, right? And it doesn't come all at once. It's not going to come from reading one book or one study, but it's going to come from, I think, telling stories over time. Just one example, even from my own family here, is I intentionally did not send this manuscript to my parents until I was done with it, and then wanted to have a conversation with them. And one of the things that I found out, for example, of just how personally this was, is that there were many churches in the South in the 60s that would actually station deacons. And actually, this is actually true of, I have at least one example of a Catholic church in New York, where a priest, for example, stood on the steps of the church with a whip, threatening any African Americans who were going to try to attend, right, to integrate the congregation. And I found out that my grandfather had been one of those guys stationed out on the steps to kind of ward off anyone integrating a service, right? And I think it's those stories that one story will generate another story. And I think for many whites, we've just repressed that history. I don't think I would have ever heard that story from my mom had we not had the conversation around the other stories that I just started to kind of try to put on the page. So I think one courageous person telling a story gives permission for a broader conversation. And then hopefully, I think, it grows a bit. And then things like repair and reparations that are difficult conversations, I think, come a lot more organically than something that just kind of comes in from outside, right? Because there's a kind of organic way in which responsibility is assumed and understood, I think, over time. So I think it's a much more organic process, and one that happens much better in community than in isolation.
Robbie, you write in your book about the two First Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia, as Patrick referenced. And one of our questioners is wondering why the Baptist Church is such a well-represented denomination for both Black and white folks. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about separations within the church. I know there were also divisions between North and South, but how did separate Black churches come to be? And how that part of the legacy of white supremacy.
All right, so we're going to open the Pandora's box of Baptist identity, and I don't know. There's something like 100 different, Baptist factions out there. So, but yeah, I mean, the big divisions are North and South. Again, and the pattern really was, white slave-owning Christians bringing enslaved people with them. And the history of that church really is they split in 1845 ahead of the Civil War as tensions were rising. And in fact, at that point, the enslaved African Americans outnumbered the white members of the church. And I think it was actually literally a worry about safety as tensions were heating up around abolitionism. So the white members actually voted to kind of remove the African Americans and build them their own church down the hill. And of course, it was supervised and staffed by a white pastor. And then after the war, that they gained their independence and kind of formed, and that story is pretty common of people who were previously enslaved and kind of not only enslaved in the fields, but literally enslaved at church, getting their own space that was under kind of white dominion and supervision, and then eventually getting independence. But I think part of it is just the prevalence of Baptists in the South, and my own denomination, Southern Baptist Convention, again formed in 1845. That same year, that church split and formed explicitly over the issue of slavery. But should be noted that by the middle of the 20th century, the Southern Baptist Convention was the largest Protestant denomination in the country, with over 16 million members. Right, so this is not a fringe movement. It really became to be the face of white American Protestantism. For sure, by the middle of the 20th century, and Black Baptists kind of went their own way. So now we have the National Baptist Convention, the Progressive Baptist Convention, several other missionary Baptists that are African American, and kind of went on their own trajectory. And just a theological point real quickly, one of the things you can see, I think, is a real difference in theological emphasis. For example, I mentioned the book of Exodus. You will hear a lot about the book of Exodus in a Black Baptist church, and still not so much in a white Baptist church.
Many white Christians romanticize Europe as part of their sort of theological heritage. Downstairs in front of our high altar, you have medallions for Rome, Constantinople, and then Canterbury in the center. Episcopalians love, England is the promised land, almost more so than biblical Israel. And we love to look towards England. Lutherans love to look towards Germany. And you mentioned liturgy and music. That's especially reflected in our liturgy and music. And often, growing up, this was sort of a badge of pride that Episcopalians looked to England. But I wonder now, through the lens of everything we're seeing in the world after the murder of George Floyd, is our romanticism about Europe partly how white supremacy persists within our churches?
Yes. I think it's the answer to that. It's worth remembering. I do think white supremacy took a very particular form in the U.S. And part of it is because whiteness took a particular form in the U.S. Baldwin is actually pretty great on this and was really clarifying for me. He said, look, it's only in America that French people are white and German people are white and British people are white, right? This was a kind of umbrella term great melting pot of America to really designate who gets to be in this privileged class, right? And so it was a kind of pan-Western European kind of designation that then we start believing means something, but it really was a kind of invented category that was designed to kind of preserve this kind of Northern and Western European privilege and power, kind of thinking backward about, the missionary impulse coming out of Western Europe, the colonial impulse that it was hand in hand with. This is all, you could trace this certainly further back. The core idea of a kind of hierarchical vision of human society, right? That doesn't begin in America. that begins in Europe with Manifest Destiny and with this idea that the job is a very patriarchal and parochial view of the world, that Western Europeans were more developed than anyone else in the world, and that their divinely ordained task was essentially to civilize the world. And Christianity bought deeply into that vision of how human society ought to be organized, and that's still it's still with us today, I think. And I don't think it would take that. Be that hard to kind of flip through the hymnal and find some places where that still lives with us in our current sentiments today.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We're really grateful for you taking the time to be with us this morning, Robbie. Thanks so much for Patrick for stepping in as the primary interlocutor this morning. Those of you who are watching, a reminder that Robbie's book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy and American Christianity, is out now. I encourage you to get a copy. It's a really powerful read. Thank you all. And those of you who are watching, please join us for worship at 11 a.m.
Thanks, everybody.
Robbie.
Thank you.